So good morning once again. I am your host, Photo Joseph, today, and I am here to take you on a tour through a little bit more advanced look of the DxO local adjustment tools in DxO PhotoLab 3. We're going to be focusing on the local adjustments, specifically taking a look at how these work, diving into each and every little piece of the puzzle in there to help you understand how you can make the most out of these tools. And we're going to start with a general tour of the tool set, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and that everybody knows exactly what is here and we're not missing anything. So let us begin. To start, to get into local adjustments, you have a couple ways to do it. There's a button up here that says local adjustments. You can click on that and that takes you into that. Or if you look on the palette on the right, you'll see there is a local adjustments tool set here, just like you have all your other ones in there, your horizon and crop and exposure compensation and everything else. You have one here as well. And if you click on this little gear button there, you'll notice the icon there is the same as the icon here. If you click on that, that also takes you into the local adjustments. Now, once you're in the local adjustments, there is a ton that you can do. But one of the interesting things I want to point out before we even get into brushing anything here is, even though this is currently open and I'm in the local adjustment space, I do still have access to the general tools. So for example, let's just say something simple like exposure compensation. I can go in here and still make adjustments to this as on a global level while simultaneously going into the local adjustments and making the adjustments there. So just something to point out, just because you are in the local adjustments palette doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get access to the other tools. Wanted to make sure that you were aware of that, because that can certainly speed up your workflow if you're not constantly jumping in and out of the local adjustment tools. So there's that. Okay, so again, to get into there, you click on that button to jump in. To get out of the local adjustments, when you do want to leave, there is a button down here on the bottom right that says close, and you'll also see that's where there's a reset button. So if I just want to start everything over again, I can click that reset and that will take care of that. So again, close there and jump back in from here. Now, once we're in here, the way you choose a tool is to right click, and that brings up the tool palette. If you aren't using a 2-button mouse, although I don't think there's too many of those out there anymore, you can also control click to bring that up. Now, this palette right here is actually quite cool. It really gives you access to all the different tools in here, including a help system. So I'll actually start with that. Right in the middle, there's a little question mark. If I click on that, it pops up in this palette here that gives me some of the keyboard shortcuts. It just tells me a little bit about the tool set in here, which is just really handy overall to allow you to very quickly get to that. And if you want to hide that, you click the little X button on there to close it. If you forget something, you want to bring it back, just right click and then click on the question mark to pull that up again. Once you're in here, let's take a look at all the different tools that we have access to. So there is, just starting over here on the left, there is a brush, which is going to be your standard brush, pretty much the same brush we've all seen in every app ever made before. There is a graduated filter that is a linear gradient. There's the control points, which, if you're not familiar with control points, are one of the most powerful ways to do any kind of adjustment. It is essentially an auto masking tool, and we will talk more about that later on, but this is an incredibly powerful tool right here. You also have auto mask. Auto mask is an auto mask brush, where this is auto mask based off of values that you click on. And again, we'll explore that more later. And this is a brush that is simply a brush like any other brush. The auto mask is a brush that automatically chooses the area to be affected based off of where you painted, but simultaneously creates a mask to protect the areas that ideally you don't want to be affecting. Underneath that, you have an eraser, which works in combination with some but not all of the tools. So for example, you can brush something and then erase it. You can even add a graduated filter and then erase from there, but you can't erase inside of a control point. So this kind of works with some of the tools, but not necessarily all of them. Next one around the clock here is the new mask button. And you'll see in a little bit how sometimes you can combine different effects, again, like that brush and the eraser. And if you want to create a new mask, you explicitly create a new mask. Other times, depending on the tool that you get, when you choose that tool, it's going to automatically create a new mask for you. So again, it just helps to be familiar with the tools and understand how those work. And then of course, here we have a reset button. So let's see here. Let's go ahead and just do some basic brushes just to show you what you can and can't combine, because I think that's an important thing to understand. Starting off with the basic paintbrush, and also while we're here, a couple of keyboard shortcuts for you. If I hold down the Command key on a Mac, and I'm sorry, I guess it's going to be the Windows key on Windows. I'm not a Windows user, but if you hold down Command key on the Mac and you scroll your mouse, you will be able to adjust that brush size. If you hold down the Shift key and you scroll the wheel, you are going to adjust the feathering. And you can see the numbers. So you see the S and the F. I can't point to them while I'm doing this, but you can see the S and the F on screen. So that's size and feathering. You can also see those numbers down here on the scale. So you have multiple controls on here: size, feather, flow, and opacity. 2 of those can be controlled with keyboard shortcuts by simply holding Shift down to adjust feathering or Command down to adjust the size. The other controls down here, flow and opacity, do make a huge difference on what you're brushing and how you're brushing it in. So if you want to, for example, brush gently where you're brushing a little bit and then a little bit more on top of it, a little bit more on top of it, you would take the flow down quite a way, and that's going to allow you to build up the adjustment over time. The opacity is going to be a general opacity for that brush layer that you have applied there as you're brushing on it. So let's go in, and I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller here and make this brush a little bit harder, just so it's really easy to see what's happening. And I'm just gonna like paint a line on here. Now, as soon as I paint something, you get this tool set that pops up, and we're gonna come back into these tools in a moment, but these are the adjustments that we have access to. And as I make a adjustment on here, you see that adjusting to wherever we have painted. So I've just drawn that little stripe on there. I'm gonna leave that in place, and then I'll go up here with the brush again, and I'll paint somewhere else. And now that is still part of this brush. So you notice as I make my changes here, it is affecting both of those. If I want to erase part of that brush, I can right click on here and switch over to the eraser. And now with the eraser tool, which has its own independent size and feathering controls, I can go in and I can start to erase part of that effect. So I'm erasing that out. Or if I'm still in the regular brush mode and I want to quickly get over to erase, I can hold down the Option key, and you'll see that the cursor changes to the eraser icon, and I can now go in there and start to erase that out. So it allows me to quite quickly move around and make changes to it. Now, the entire brush stack that you've built can be moved around as well. So if you wanted to move something, you can. You probably wouldn't do this for a brush itself, but for things like the gradients, that certainly can come in handy to be able to simply move that whole thing around in there. Now, let's see, I talked about how some of these can be combined and some of them can't. So at this point, as I pointed out, I'm gonna actually just reset this and start over to make it really super clear. Say I draw a line on here and I'm making a change to that. And then I draw another line on here, and because it's part of the same one, I'm getting the same change on both of those. Now, what if I want to have a brushed area that is affected differently? Well, if I right click on here now and I choose New Mask, now with this brush still selected, or I can choose another tool if I need to, I brush again, and this is now separate from this control. So this one I've darkened. I can come over here to this one and we'll just lighten that one just to show that they're different. And so now we have these 2 different completely independent adjustments here that I have made. If I was to go in here and say, okay, I want to add an auto mask to this, if I control click on there and I choose auto mask, you'll notice now as I start painting, and I'll just kind of paint over the building here, this is automatically a different control. We're seeing a different control set. You can't actually combine the auto mask with the other tools. It is always going to live independently. So it's just important to be aware of the different tools and how some of them can be combined and some of them cannot. And that just kind of will affect how you are, of course, working on your image. Alrighty, let's see here. Checking my notes real quick. All right, so we've shown the different mask tools in there. Let's take a look at the palette that shows up over here on the right. So we have this thing called local adjustments we looked at earlier, and you'll notice in here I now have 3 different brushes that I've applied. There's the first brush that I did, the darkening one, there's the second one, the lightening one, and then that auto mask, which actually didn't affect. Let's just go ahead and make some change to that just so we can see it there. And each one of these is an independent layer that I can hide if I want to just temporarily hide it. So this little eye icon there, I can do that, and that will hide the effect. It hides the whole mask. We no longer see what's going on there. Or I can reveal that whole thing, or I can delete an individual one. So let's say the auto mask, I decide I don't want that anymore. I can select it here and hit the delete button on there. I can also, I'm going to hit undo to bring that back. I can also simply click on it in here and then hit delete on the keyboard, and that will delete it as well. So pretty good management in there of the different pieces. The palette right here doesn't seem like it's terribly useful when you only have a couple of these, but as you start building more and more adjustments into a single image, suddenly having this list here becomes extremely handy. The ability to go in and individually turn some of them on or off can be certainly a lifesaver. If you are really getting into a complex adjustment on an image and you've got multiple stacks of brushes in there and you're trying to decide or trying to figure out where one of these effects is coming from that you did a while ago, having this stack over here is certainly a huge convenience in there to be able to do. The other nice thing about this, even if you aren't going to get rid of an effect, it's a nice way to see a before and after for an individual adjustment. So I can turn off local adjustments up here and turn off the entire palette. And now everything that I've done in local adjustments is gone. But if I want to just turn an individual one off, I can do that here with the eyes on there, which is certainly super handy. I also want to point out the masking view. So you'll notice right now we see that blue line. In fact, let me just add another brush on here, and I'm going to draw a line on there where I haven't actually, I actually needed, I forgot my own rule here. Got to make a new mask. There we go. New mask, brush in there, and I haven't made any adjustments to this yet. So right now, we're not seeing the effect of that mask. I don't know where that is. Or maybe, just maybe I've done an adjustment, but it's super, super subtle, and I'll just do something that's like barely adjusted on there. So if you're looking closely, you can see it, but maybe not really. So it can be a little bit difficult when you have these very gentle masks to know where the mask is. What have I affected? Now, as I roll my mouse over the little, let's call it the handle icon of this, you'll see that everywhere where I painted lights up in blue, showing me that mask. And even if I have a whole new mask that I've painted, I haven't done anything to it, so let's say there's no effect applied to that at all, as I roll the mouse over it, then that does highlight to show me what's there. And because this one is currently selected, it's still highlighted there. Also, that will always stay visible until you make an adjustment. So that adjustment mask is still there because I haven't actually changed anything. As soon as I start to change something, now it will disappear. But if at any time you want to force it to show you the mask, again, you can hover over it to do that, or there's a button down here that says show masks. And when you do that, whichever mask is selected will show the whole mask regardless, even while I'm working on it, it disappears temporarily. And then as soon as I let go, it pops back again. And as you roll your mouse over the list over here on the right, you'll notice that with show masks turned on, it highlights on the screen for you very easily. So you can see exactly where that is. So lots of different ways to control it in there. All right, let me get rid of a bunch of these. Let's actually just reset the whole thing. And let's take a tour. I'll just do a big splotch in the middle there. Let's take a tour through the controls. These controls are on what we call the Equalizer. You have this row of controls allowing you complete image adjustment control here. So you have on this first palette, you have exposure. So we already saw that, simple exposure up or down. You have contrast, you have micro contrast. And I want to point out too that all of these adjustments you have access to globally as well over here on the right, but the fact that you have access to them as a local adjustment is what really makes this powerful. So if, for example, I think micro contrast is a good example of this, I wanted to affect the sky and really make those clouds stand out like so, that's something I could do with, let's hide the mask in there, I can do with micro adjustment just on the sky without affecting the rest of the image. And as we get into things like control points, you'll see just how deep that power, or just how powerful that that masking can be to isolate one part of the image over another, and how quickly you can do that. So going back, going through them again, starting over, we have exposure, contrast, and micro contrast. And then you have Clearview Plus, another fantastic one to be able to use locally. Clearview Plus is one of those where the whole idea of the filter is it clears the haze out of the sky. But if you have an image where, let's say you've got a person in the front and a hazy background behind them, the person's not hazy, but if I just do Clearview Plus in the whole image, the person's skin is going to get a little bit crunchy and weird. So by being able to add the Clearview Plus just to the localized areas, in this case, the sky or whatever it might be, then you can really have a lot more control over the image and get away with using a lot more Clearview Plus than you might normally consider using if you were applying it, or if you had to apply it to the whole image. You also have highlight and midtone and shadow recovery in here, and then a black point adjustment as well. Now that's just the first row of controls. If you click on the second icon down here, we get into our color controls, and you'll see if I hover the mouse over it and just pause for a moment, it does pop up a little tooltip there. So that's lightness, that's color in here. And then here you've got your vibrancy, saturation, color temperature, color tint, and even a hue rotation. And you can reset these at any point by hitting that little circle thing there. Next one is this one is called, what's it called? Detail, that's what it's called. And under detail, you have sharpness and you have blur. Another fantastic tool to be able to add localized sharpness. Quite often, one of the things that I'll do a lot in images is sharpen the eyes. Not that the eyes were not in focus to begin with, because sharpness isn't about focus, although if you have a little bit of slight out of focus, you can kind of recover a bit of it with sharpness. It's really about just making that area pop. And if you have a portrait and you really want the eyes to pop, which is typically what you do, adding a brush around the eyes and just adding a little bit of sharpness to them can really make the eyes pop out. And it's a really nice little technique to use in there. So that is the extent of those tools. The last thing I'll show you in this tool palette is while I can click on each one of these to bring up those controls, if I hold down the command key and I click on these, it actually loads multiple palettes at once. So I could say, show me the lightness and the detail sliders, or I can click on all three of them and have all three of those up at once, which is another option that you have. So that's kind of cool. So you just have that really control whether you want to have a bunch of stuff at once or just one at a time on there. And that is everything that I wanted to show you in the tools themselves and how to find them and how they work. All right, we're back and let's take a look at actually doing some proper adjustments for this image. I'm going to reset this so that we are totally back to basics on here, make sure the full image is reset. And on a photo like this, you know, it's a sunrise scene. It's got these kind of dark, almost silhouetted buildings in there. This is in India, by the way. And, you know, there's a lot of different things, different directions I could take this. But let's say I'm looking at it right now and I'm thinking, I want to work on the sky, but not the water, not the reflection of the water. I like the water. I like the way that looks. I just want to work on the sky. So I'm going to use a gradient filter. Personally, I find gradient filters to be one of the most powerful tools. Obviously, using the control points is I shouldn't say gradient is most powerful. I should say that gradient is one of my preferred tools to use. I like really soft, subtle gradients of an effect. I find that I can often get a look that I want with minimal work by doing that. I'm just throwing that out there as a personal observation. But let's say I want to do a gradient in here. First of all, the way that this works is you click where you want to start the beginning of the gradient itself, and then you drag to where you want it to end. And with that up, let me just do a massive change on here. I'm in vibrancy, that's not where I wanted. Let's do a massive change on here just to make it clear what's happening. Everything before this line has the effect at 100%, completely applied. Everything past this little gray dot here has no effect applied. And the transition, the actual linear gradient part of this, is from the beginning here to the end. So if I make this really small, then the gradient is just from here to here. And if I get my mouse off of that so that the lines are no longer showing, you can see that the effect is applied 100% up here, 0% here, and then there's this subtle gradation of where it is being transitioning from on to off, if you will. The bigger I make this, the more subtle that gradient is. So if I wanted a gradient where the effect started at the very top and ended at the bottom, then I would position the beginning at the top and the end down here at the bottom. And that's going to give me that very subtle, very clean gradation from one end to the other. If, on the other hand, for something like this sky, I want to affect the entire sky, but then as it gets towards the ground, I don't want to have this hard line of where the effect ends. What I might choose to do here is make a smaller gradient. So let's make that a bit more gentle in there, a bit more drastic, I should say. And maybe I'll go from, let's say, the top of that building there just to behind the horizon line. And now whatever effect I apply is going to apply entirely to the sky, but then quickly gradate from affected to not affected across the bottom in here. Now, not only can you move this around, you can also rotate it. So to rotate it, all you need to do is click anywhere. Oops, delete that. Sorry about that. All you need to do is click on the little gray dot on there and just drag it wherever you'd like. So as I move this around, I can say, you know, I want this to be graded off from the side here, like so. Whatever the case may be. And so you just grab that and you can spin it wherever you like in there, which is a nice, easy way to make those adjustments. So let's do a effect on the sky. I'm going to pull this back down, maybe about to there, bring it up a little bit, and I'll start manipulating it. So I go in and I decide, you know, I want to make this a little bit darker. Maybe I go into the saturation, make it a little bit more saturated. Cool. All right, we're getting there. We're getting somewhere. And at some point, you know, you go, maybe I should have taken this the other way around. Maybe instead of affecting the sky, what I really wanted to do was affect the water in here. And let's just say for the sake of the demo, this wasn't just a simple gradient, but I had actually really spent a lot of time in there with the brush and gone in and very meticulously painted something in, and you're going, but I really want to flip the script here. I want to do this the other way around. Well, instead of having to redo everything, you have this simple inverse icon right here. If you click that, it flips the effect around. It does the opposite of what you just did so that the areas that you had affected are now not affected and vice versa. So that can be super, super handy when you're getting into these adjustments to be able to go in and make those changes. It's one of those things where I've definitely used this a lot myself, where you're just not quite sure the best approach. Should I affect this part of the image or should I affect that part of the image? Keeping in mind that global effects will apply over the entire image. And so sometimes those localized effects, you just can't quite decide which way to go. And this is a good way to be able to approach it, knowing that you can flip that upside down at any point down the road, which is definitely super handy. And this works for not just things like gradients, right? So let's say that I wanted to do a localized mask over the tree line and we're going to call it a pagoda there. I'm not quite sure what we would call this, but anyway, let's just say that I want to affect that. And so I decide, well, this is a pretty good use for auto mask, right? I've got this really darkened area in here that should mask out pretty well. So let's give it a try. So I go over here and I select auto mask, and let's talk a little bit about how auto mask actually works. And then I'm going to paint it in and show you again, flipping that over and where that might come in handy. So first of all, let's make this bigger so it's easier to see what's going on. It's kind of an odd tool in that it looks like it's a feathering tool, but it's not. You have two different areas of the brush. The center part of the brush is dark solid blue, and that is the area that is sampling the pixels, the tone range of the pixels that you're clicking on. And you are basically telling the software that what you want to mask, what you want to affect, what you want to build a mask of is the areas that look like what's under the brush, what is inside of that dark area. The lighter circle, the much larger circle outside, is basically you're saying to the software, anything that looks like what's inside of the dark area, grab it in the light area. Right, so the inside dark area is your sample source. This is what you're saying. This is the area that I want to this is the type of pixels that I want to select. The outside area is saying, look for those pixels all the way out here. So typically you don't want to have a huge brush like this, because this is going to just kind of like, if I brush over this, what am I selecting? Am I selecting that dark background? Am I selecting the sky? The software doesn't know. So generally you want to make this a little bit smaller, and you probably want to zoom in a little bit as well, just to make sure that you're not getting too, trying to do too much with too far back. But now with this selected, as I go through here, I can very easily select all of the trees and the building in here. And you see, I'm really being very, very sloppy about this. All I'm making sure that I do is not let the center area of the brush go outside of the dark areas. And if I get to something that's too small, this too precise, I can just make this a little bit smaller in there to get that in. And then of course, making sure that the outside area does cover the entire area that I want to affect. Now, one of the weird kind of things that you may have already picked up in watching this is that you don't see a difference in the area that's brushed. There's no indicator in here that I have actually selected this part of the image, but not that part of the image. So with that in mind, it does take a little bit of trust in what you're doing. And of course, you can always go back in and clean things up later. But it does take a little bit of trust. But now that I have drawn across that whole area in there, let's also get a little bit down here. So here's an area where I'm getting a little bit, it's a little bit smaller. So I'm actually going to zoom in. Notice too, the brush size doesn't change as you zoom in. I think that's a really important point to remember about this. The brush size is not a pixel measurement based off of the original image. It is more like a size on the screen. So as I zoom in or zoom out, my brush size doesn't change. So I can zoom in here, and then I have the ability to go in there and get really precise without having to use a teeny, teeny, tiny little brush in there, which is certainly convenient. So zoom back out a little bit. Let's keep painting this area in. And I'm not gonna worry about getting this totally perfect, but we get the basics of it. Let's do just a little bit more here. And then I think we're gonna call it a day. Okay. Zoom back out of that. To zoom out to see the whole thing, click that little arrow up there, and there you can see the mask that we've created. So I still haven't gotten all the reflections down here, but that's okay. So now with that done, I will let's go to exposure, and I'm just going to use this just to show what is affected. I'm going to crank this way, way up just so you can see what has been affected here. Now, at this point, you might look at it and go, well, that's not a super clean mask, but remember, this is not the effect I would do. I'd never crank the adjustment up this much. And so we're really seeing kind of an egregious effect around here. But if we do something actually realistic, like in this case, maybe I want to totally silhouette that out, I have a much more believable look. And I can see right there, I got a little cleanup to do in there, but I get a much more believable look in here. So it really can be quite effective in that regard. So now we are talking about inverting, right? Inverting the mask. So let's say that I've done all this and I decide, you know, darkening the tree line and everything in here isn't really what I wanted to do. What I really wanted to do is affect everything but that. So now with that auto mask selected, I can click that invert, and I realize this is not going to look right everywhere because I haven't finished drawing the mask. But now, for example, I can lighten up the sky. Let's say that for whatever reason, that's what I wanted to do. I could lighten up the sky without affecting the buildings in there, which is definitely a super, super convenient part of that. For this one, I want to use control points. So let's start with something really simple. For this image, I want to affect the orange parts of her sari. I don't want to affect the red. I don't want to affect the background. I just want to affect the orange. So the auto mask brush that we just used might be a perfectly good way to do that. But another way to do that is going to be using the control points. So I'm going to right click on here. So I'm actually make sure we're totally reset. Yes, we are. Okay. I'm going to right click on here and choose control points. And let's make sure we're in the positive control points. We'll come to negative ones in a moment. And I click on this, and when you first click on it, you see the circle, and that's it. I go, okay, well, let's just say I want to make it darker. We'll just make it darker just to make it really obvious what's happening. You drag that down, you go, wow, look at that. It darkened just the orange part of her sari. Well, that's kind of interesting. How did it do that? Well, if I click on show masks, we can see the mask that has been created. And now we're not seeing that blue mask, we're seeing a more traditional grayscale mask, where whatever is white is selected, whatever is dark is not selected. And you can see in here very quickly how the mask is being built. Effectively, what's happening with control points, if you're new to control points, is whatever you click on, whatever area you've clicked on, that becomes the sample. You are saying to the software, I want to select pixels that look like this, and that's going to mean their color value and their luminance value, so how bright or dark they are as well as their color. I don't know where in the algorithm, if it's more towards color, less towards luminance. I couldn't say exactly, but in general, it is a combination that for the most part works really, really well. So you can see here that it has selected the majority of that sari. And as I move this around, we can see that some parts of it are being a little bit more selected than others. So that's the basic instructions. Select pixels based off of this color range, but then only select them that are inside of this circle here. Now, it's not a hard line. So as I move this out to here, you see that we're starting to get a little bit more of her sari down here. And it's not like this is not affected at all. So don't think of this line like the edge of a circle and nothing beyond it is selected. Think of that line more like the general edge. Roughly around here, we're going to end it and not select a whole lot after that. And while that may sound very wishy-washy, and you're thinking, well, hold on, I want a little bit more precise control over that. Part of what makes this so effective is that it's not precise in the sense of here is a hard edge line to end here. Part of what makes this effective is that you have this very general and precise at the same time, if that makes any sense, adjustments that tend to look very realistic, very believable. So in this case, if I want to adjust her whole dress, I could just make this bigger to select the whole dress, but we can also see how we're starting to get the background in there as well, which I may not really want. So there's a couple of approaches to this. And the first approach is to simply add more control points. Let's make this smaller. We'll make sure we do get the primary area in there. And then I'm just going to go down here and click on the dress down below and add that to it as another control point. And I can find another position for, let's say, right about there. And then we can even add another one in here. And we can add multiple control points to affect the specific parts of the region, parts of the image that we want. In fact, you can add control points that have nothing to do with the values of the area where I started. So let's just say that I was going to make this darker, and I wanted to have not only her dress be darker, but I also wanted, I don't know, let's do the foreground. That probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but we'll do it. This darker as well. Even though the pixels here have nothing to do with the pixels in here, they are now selected and going to be part of this adjustment as well. But for the most part, usually you wouldn't do that. Usually if you're going to do an adjustment here, you're going to do a completely different adjustment. So you would not do it that way. You would create a new mask and then go in with your control points and select the foreground there and do that separately. That's more likely the way you would do it, but I'm just pointing out that you can do it however you like in there. Okay, let's go back to this, looking at the masks. And we can see in here that a little bit of the red on her dress is getting selected as well. If I want to, I can protect that part of it from the general area that's been selected to specifically say, do not select anything like this. And the way you do that is with negative control points. So you see that is right down here. It's the control point with a little minus icon on it. And the pop-up tooltip says protect an area. So with that selected, I will go in here and click to add a negative control point onto the red part of her sari, and we can see that we have now effectively darkened that, saying that we are not going to affect that area. That could be useful to protect her face, for example. Maybe her face is getting part of that selection as well. So now with that all done, let me hide the masks, and now I'll go in here and make adjustments to it, and we can see how we are really doing a nice job of affecting the dress. Now, if I go really too far, we start to see those hot spots, but in general, that's not what you're doing, right? You're doing something that's a much more subtle. So maybe I want to make that just a little bit darker. Let's go into the colors and make it a little bit more saturated in there. Or maybe I want to take the hue and rotate it just a little bit more toward one color or another. And you can do these very subtle adjustments in here. And if you need more control points, you want to have that more precise in there, you can certainly go in and just keep on adding control points to it. So super, super handy to be able to do. Now, in this case, I'm using it on her dress specifically, but it can be things like your entire background, right? So if let me just reset all this. Let's say that I want to make the background darker in here. Okay, so let's add a new control point, make sure I'm positive. I'm going to drop one back here and let's view the mask so I can be sure of what I'm getting. And let's just take this and make it really, really big. So now I've got the background wall is quite broadly selected. The pillars are largely selected, not entirely, but largely. But we can see that we're getting some spill onto her. So let's protect her. Let's grab the little negative one, drop one on her face on there, and drop one on the sari, and we drop one on the broom on there, and start. And you see as well as I move this around how it really, you get a lot of very good previews of what's being protected. And keep in mind that your brush size or your control point size, when you add a new one, is going to be based off the size of the last one you made. So I just added these negative ones that were actually quite huge. So maybe that's not really what I wanted to do. Let's make these a little bit smaller, a little bit more precise in there. Here we go, shrink those down. So now I've got the background nicely selected, the foreground hardly selected. Again, the kind of generalness of this is what makes this really effective. And let's hide the masks and let's take the, not vibrancy, let's take the exposure on that and darken that a little bit. And we can see we get this nice natural looking shadow happening up there in the corner. So again, really, really lots and lots of control over that. And again, keeping in mind that we can also invert this at any time. So if I go in and I go, I've built this whole mask, but now I want to flip it the other way around, I can click the invert button and it flips that around. And now we're affecting the opposite of that. My intention was to finish filling in the water based off of an auto mask of this. So I'm not going to repaint this whole thing, but let me just do part of it. So the idea here was, let's just say that I've done this and I have made some changes to it, right? So I can, oops, I keep doing that in the vibrancy. Let's go back to exposure. So I've made changes to that. I'll make it bright just to make it obvious. And I go, okay, what I really want to do now is fill in the whole water area underneath. You would think, all right, well, what I'll do is I'll combine this with a regular brush. I go over to regular brush and I click on there and I start painting in. Unfortunately, this forces a new mask. You cannot add a regular brush to an auto mask brush. So what you have to do is stay in the auto mask brush, make sure the auto mask is selected, or it'll just automatically create a new one. And then you would have to basically go in here and repaint over. Let's just make this bigger so it's faster. Oops, wrong keyboard shortcut there. There we go. Zoom in. You basically just have to go in and repaint over that whole thing. And when you stop, you'll pause for a moment. And you go, okay, it's auto masking, so we need to fill that in. All right, that got it. We need to fill this area in here. Got it. There you go. And that's effectively what you have to do. You have to go in and kind of individually grab those areas that you may have, that the auto mask missed, because obviously that's what it's designed to do. But if you're trying to fill in all the gaps, you do have to kind of manually go in there and just fill each one of those in.